Well, it's my pleasure to introduce you, to welcome you all to one of ISER's noontime seminars. By the way, for those of you who haven't noticed, we now have a clock in the room. So we are making progress in our physical facilities. This seminar is being presented by Dana DeFeo. It's work she's done with Matt Berman and Diane Hirschberg. The title, as you can see, Strong Opinions, Weak Understandings, How Knowledge Shapes Opinions About Teacher Futures. This is an outgrowth of work that Dana, Matt, and Diane were doing on teacher retention issues here in Alaska. So, Dana?
Okay, so thank you for coming. And Chris told me to stay on camera, so I'm going to try to do that. So as Ralph had said, Diane, Matt, and I worked on this, looking at the data that we had collected as part of the HB 278 study, which was the teacher salary tenure study we put out about a year ago, and we are just reworking some of those data from that study, data that seemed to have some empirical significance and also that we were discussing and found really, really interesting. So just to fit this into what CAEPR is doing as we're building a research agenda, we've kind of got three separate areas. College and career readiness is new because that's what I'm really interested in focusing on. Diane has been focused a lot on Indigenous education, and Diane and Lexi were doing the teacher supply and demand work. And of course, all of these inform the others. So this particular project really fits into this sort of circle. So to just get started, we've got this cover story. This is May 2012, and teacher tenure comes under attack. So the parents of 9 California school kids filed lawsuit against the state saying that the state's tenure policy basically were robbing their children of a good education by making it impossible for teachers to be fired, that it retained grossly ineffective teachers. So big lawsuit, 2 years later, there's a court ruling, they rule on it, and there were 5 statutes found to be unconstitutional, including those related to teacher tenure, dismissal, and layoff. So this is going on in the lower 48, and then in Alaska, just about the time this ruling comes out, or when the ruling is expected, passes the Omnibus Education Bill, asking for a whole bunch of studies around education policy and education practice in the state, but one in particular, the one that we ended up working on, was for the Department of Administration to deliver an evaluation of and recommendations for teacher tenure. So we come in 2014, and we had a contract to do a policy review, an economic analysis, and a public opinion survey around this topic. So that's how we got involved. So, are you laughing at me already?
No.
Okay, just checking.
And
just
you might want to say, and this is part of this is a larger study.
Right.
Teacher tenure is one piece of what we were working on.
Right, we did a study that included teacher salary and all kinds of stuff. This is just the tenure piece that we wanted to talk about today. And I sound like I'm from New Jersey when I'm projecting my voice. I can hear it. Wow. All right. So just taking a look, actually just for what is tenure for teachers in the state of Alaska, effectively it's due process. So after a probation period, the district has to provide justification before they dismiss a teacher who's earned tenure. And that's, in a nutshell, that's what it is, right? So looking at where tenure comes from, am I doing something wrong?
You're just a little quiet on stream.
Okay, sorry.
No, you're okay. Hear you.
So just looking at the history of tenure, in the 1880s, the federal government said we need to basically protect our employees from political influence, and so they went ahead and passed, the Pendleton Civil Service Act. And then in just a few years later, Massachusetts goes, hey, we need to extend this to the teaching profession, give them a brief probationary period, but after that, they need to just cause to be dismissed. So we're talking, this is old. And this also had some other benefits that were noted early on, is that you didn't have to rehire teachers every year when you had tenure, so teachers could plan on a job, and they didn't have all of this administrative burden of all of this paperwork. But also, particularly at this time, with teachers knowing they had a job, it kind of enticed them to stay in the profession a little bit longer, because back then it was a lot of women who would teach until they had kids, so it was also trying to get teachers to extend just a little bit longer when they knew that they had a contract to teach the following year. So 100 years ago, the National Education Association, which is the largest says that tenure is integral to the teaching profession, and they've not changed that point of view. And so by the 1960s, tenure or something like tenure was provided in all 50 of the states with two fundamental tenets, right? Protection from arbitrary dismissal and this idea of ongoing or continued employment. So all over the US, everybody's got it. But then in the last, 20 years? So Marshall, 1998, and his people, they look at tenure policy across 50 states, largely similar, like, the two fundamental tenets, protection from arbitrary dismissal and ongoing employment, those are the same in all the 50 states. These two people do it in 2010, pretty much no change. But then since then, we've had 3 states that have eliminated tenure, and then Idaho, Florida, North Carolina, Kansas, and then Idaho tried, but the voters then repealed the law. 16 states have also weakened tenure. For example, they require student performance evaluations to go into tenure decisions, and 7 states have passed laws that allow districts to put teachers back on probation for different reasons. So we see a weakening of tenure across
What happened in those 3 states? Did they lose teachers? I mean, were there ramifications, or is this still new enough?
It's pretty new, but there's been some serious concern with the teacher supply.
North Carolina has seen a huge drop in the number of young people going into teacher education, as well as outflow of actual educators. The attack on tenure has been embedded in a constellation of policies that have been seen as very unfriendly to public education and to educators.
Yeah. And in North Carolina, it's confounding because their salaries are also not where they ought to be. So it's hard to know. If we consider tenure as part of teacher compensation and benefits package, it becomes a little more confounded, but it has had some negative impacts, but this is all still pretty new, so we're starting to see it for sure. So when I first started doing this work before I was in teacher education, I was thinking, well, we have all of these new worker protections that have been enacted since the 1800s, so what does tenure do? Like, do we really still need it? So, civil rights, equal pay, ADA, all of these things, but the difference, as I learned more doing this work, is that when you're wronged and you're protected under any of these things, it is your responsibility to show that the employer wronged you. Whereas when you have tenure, it's on the employer to actually document and provide just cause for your dismissal. And that's an important distinction. But also, when we look at how teachers are compensated, it's sort of a different profession. If you get out of college and get a job in a classroom, the idea is that we want teachers to stay there for 30, 35 years for the duration of their career. So instead of the rest of us where we get salary increases by getting promoted, they earn these modest salary steps and increments by spending more time in the classroom and getting more education. And so you can have 2 teachers, teaching in the same job who have vastly different salaries because of the experience in education. The salary accumulates over time. Without tenure, there's nothing that makes it illegal to fire that experienced teacher and hire a cheaper one. Does that make sense?
But doesn't that happen in other professions as well?
Sure does.
As the benefits go up, pretty soon that person goes for whatever reason can be manufactured, and a cheaper person is hired.
Right, which is why tenure protects that situation from happening.
And the thing we see also is that experience correlates with teacher quality, and so it would be hard to argue that, generally speaking, right? So it's hard to argue that you can replace an experienced teacher with a brand new fresh one and have the exact same job being performed. And teachers in a lot of professions, the workers you described, they could apply for a promotion and go into a higher level of responsibility, but we're trying to keep teachers in the classroom as much as we can, serving kids and providing good education opportunities. They can be promoted and move into administration, but keeping teachers in the classroom is a good thing. Keeping good ones there is what we're going for. Did that answer your question?
It wasn't a question,
Oh,
it was sort
okay.
of a statement.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Did I? Sorry.
That's okay.
All right. So then we've got unions in all of this too, right? So, we know that lots going on with unions nationally. Public employee unions are probably the strongest ones, but they're under a tremendous amount of attack, and teacher unions in particular, right? And so when we're looking at the reason teacher unions are getting it is we've got these concerns about the quality of public education, and superficially it's really easy to make a connection between teacher tenure and the quality of the teachers in the classroom. So that's gotten a lot of attention lately. So when I boil down the arguments, on the one side you've got education reformers who say tenure makes it impossible, almost impossible to fire a bad teacher, and teachers just slack off once they get tenure. But on the other side, you've got people who say teachers need due process, and tenure is only due process. But teachers need it, other public employees get it, and hardly anybody has to wait 3 years for due process. Most people get it after like a 6-month probationary period, 9 months, something like that. They also say teachers need to be able to do the right thing without fear of losing their job. They need to be able to stand up to administration in defense of kids. They need to be able to give kids grades regardless of how influential their parents might be. So they need that protection. And it's not as powerful as the reformers make it out to be, that these things are not quite true. So two sides of the argument. Oops, wrong way, sorry. And so what we've got then is public opinion in the midst of all of this, and it's pretty hostile for tenure. What we see is that consistently, we looked at a bunch of different public opinion polls. There aren't a ton, but all of them pretty much consistently show that the public would like to end tenure by a 2-to-1 margin. And so...
And administrators.
So, yeah. So where does that come from? These are just, I don't know if you can read it. This says we must fire bad teachers. We must fire bad teachers. The key to saving American education. And this one, Rotten Apples, it's almost impossible to fire a bad teacher. So we've got these on the newsstand, so the public,
How old are those?
so these are, oh brother, 2014, 15. So this one
Okay.
was Vergara, and this one I can read, 2014 November,
Yeah.
Okay,
and so really recently.
yeah.
If anybody knows when Lindsey Graham had his Maverick moment, that also. So.
Way to track things.
So anyway, when I'm standing at the grocery store, this is all I read when I'm like looking at, while I'm waiting to check out, right? And then we've got some other stuff that's probably suggesting, shaping public opinion. So what does the literature say about all of this? So what we're seeing in the literature is that the real issue with teacher quality is not that we can't fire bad teachers, but it's holding on to good teachers. Good teachers are leaving the profession much faster than bad teachers are staying in. You get what I was trying to say, even though it came out not eloquently, right? So that's one of the teacher quality issues is keeping good teachers or actually getting people to go into the teaching profession in the first place. Teacher ed programs across the nation are seeing a decline in enrollments.
Huge.
So we do know that that experience correlates with effectiveness broadly. The longer people teach, the better they are at it, and the tenure does impact teacher retention. So teachers do consider it, and there are some interesting studies, especially where like a state line divides a major city, and you can see what's happening on either side of that line when they change tenure policies. And then we also see that the inequities we see in the classrooms everywhere, that the teacher supply follows that, right? That high turnover and low experienced teachers tend to be in low income, high minority areas. We see this all the time, and that's sort of a perennial issue. So now going back to why we're here, we're supposed to talk about.
Before we go
Sure.
back there, thank you for putting that back. You glossed over my term,
Mm-hmm.
and it's meant to be a negative term, that the teacher quality program is not in firing the bad ones.
Mhm.
But don't you believe that the reason the general public 2-to-1 says get rid of tenure,
Mhm.
because in their mind, when you get rid of tenure, you get rid of bad teachers.
Mhm.
When you have tenure, you can't get rid of bad teachers.
Right.
And until the teachers unions, et cetera,
Mhm.
address this, how do you get rid of bad teachers,
Right.
it's going to continue to be get rid of tenure.
I think so. Yeah, that's sort of the macro, or the master narrative, right?
Yes,
Is that-
yes, I
is-
was gonna say way
Mhm.
broad.
very
Okay.
broad, and I think that these things
Contribute.
contribute to that. My next project, I really want to do a critical discourse analysis of this stuff. Like, what are these things saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you look at the narrative about our teacher education programs in this state, the president is saying we need to, merge them into one, we need to get rid of deans. There's all this language, even in Alaska, with no evidence. There's not a shred of evidence about the quality of the graduates of our programs and the quality of our teachers
Yeah.
that is being used to fuel these conversations. So I think it's yes, we have an enormous issue about that.
But when
If you
we-
can get rid of a bad teacher and replace them with a good teacher, and the problem is the good teachers leave faster than you get rid of the bad than the bad. Than there are bad
Exactly.
ones,
Right.
and you still
Yeah.
don't get
So-
anywhere.
I think that they were saying that, like, when you look at teachers and you divide them into, and measuring teacher quality is a hairy problem in and of itself. I almost don't want to get into, but general terms, if we take the methods that people have done, that, if you divide teachers into performance quartiles, that the people in that highest performing quartile are gone so fast. And actually, the people in the low performing quartile are gone relatively quickly too.
Mhm.
Those are the ones that leave the most. The low performers tend to self-select out more often than not, is what the literature is showing.
Or the students drive them
So,
out.
I guess, or that. So the highest performing and the lowest performing ones are the ones that leave the profession, and you're sort of left with the middle, at least as people are sort of looking at long-term movement patterns there. So we were supposed to provide an evaluation and recommendations for teacher tenure. This is what we were supposed to do. So here's what we did. So to kick it off, we started out with some, key informant and focus group interviews. What we wanted to know is, I see my notes are out of order here. Great job. We needed to do a survey, a public opinion survey, so we wanted that to be rooted in something. So we started with these focus group interviews to kind of get a sense of what's tenure in Alaska. So we talked to all of these people. And in focus group interviews in particular, we had these disagreements arose. We also worked, the word it said yesterday was debates erupted. I'm not sure which. But, between people who participated in the tenure process, teachers, principals had very experiences with tenure. And so we actually had to call Deed for clarification and say, are we understanding this? So what we got is that people may not understand tenure policy as it's written. The focus group interviews really revealed that, and so we thought, well, if we're going to do an opinion survey, there's going to be really weak response process validity if we don't actually check and make sure people actually know what it is we're talking about. So we built in this other variable to our work. So we were supposed to look at these things, but we went ahead and added 6 true-false questions to test tenure understanding. And we were able to see how much people understand or misunderstand, and when they understand or when they misunderstand, did they overestimate the protections that tenure offers, or do they underestimate the protection that tenure offers? So what do they think tenure's doing if they misunderstand? So we added this ended up becoming our independent variable for this analysis. This is where we're deviating from that other study because it only called for what's in the blue box. So we did public opinion, and we ended up, for this analysis, just looking at teachers and principals in reality, because our response wasn't big enough for any of the other groups, but also because we didn't have a response rate, but we do know about teachers and principals, about how many there are in the state, so we could check and see, how representative our group was. So we got, 554 teachers, 97 principals. 7% of the teaching force in the state and 19% of principals in the state responded to our survey. And I didn't put the big N here, but basically on these variables, on these demographic things, the people who took our survey look a whole lot like teachers in the state. So it ended up being a pretty nice representative sample as far as these things go, even though it was a self-selecting population. And you'll see our numbers are small, but the fact that we're still able to detect significant results means we're spot on with something, right? So the first thing we looked at is just understanding. So we've got teachers and principals. For the presentation I put principals are, oh dang, I think I did it backwards. Well, blue and green were supposed to mean something, but I don't think they do anymore. But anyway, so in this box, these are the people who got the questions wrong. So if you answered one of these questions wrong, it means that you are overestimating tenure protection. most people know that it's false that you can't fire a tenured teacher for any reason. Very few people got that wrong. But whether or not tenure can be transferred between school districts, it can't. Whether or not a teacher can be laid off for budget reasons, they can. People didn't understand that quite as well. So then there's underestimating protections, how tenure functions with seniority. You can bump teachers. If you thought that was false, you were really underestimating the protection that it offers, and that the district has to provide justification related to performance. So these were just the descriptive statistics. But then what we did, and Matt, I don't know if you, what did you think? Is this what you wanted me to do? I'm not good at scatter plots are just, I'm having a hard time. I ended up having to make one with the table. But we've got this, you know, with teachers and principals, we've got misunderstanding here. So the more you misunderstand, more people here. And here's sort of the line. Overestimators are up here, underestimators are down here. So we're really talking about the people who misunderstand and really overestimate tenure protections is where we found a lot of our significant results. So you can see that we're talking about small numbers when we start parsing it out this way, but we're still seeing some interesting relationships.
So just to help you interpret that, I think there were six questions,
6.
but one of them, only 5 of them could be overestimated
Yeah.
versus underestimated. One was just sort of,
So, yeah, this one wasn't directional because we didn't know. If you didn't know that, we didn't know if you think it takes longer, if it takes less. Yeah.
right. But only a few people got them all, but the median number of people was like half right.
Yeah. So it just so what I had intended is that every time you see blue, it's teachers, and green is principals, and I think I'm consistent with this from here on out. Yeah, so since I did a rotten job on this slide, let's not spend too much more time on it if you're really wanting to know where the numbers are. So that was our descriptive statistics on the independent variable. So now getting into the dependent variable here, right? First, supports. So how much people agree with this statement? I don't support tenure. Teachers generally don't agree with that. About a third of principals do. We just used this one question, but then when we started looking at, so how does misunderstanding predict the way they're going to answer that? So the more teachers misunderstand tenure, the more they want to keep it. And for principals, it's the opposite. The more they misunderstand tenure, the more they want to get rid of it. So oddly though, when we looked at over and underestimating tenure protections, so the more teachers overestimate tenure protections, the more they want to keep it. That makes sense too. It's a good thing, they want it. But principals said the same thing. So that was unusual, right? So and we were talking about this morning. Maybe it's because principals used to be teachers, maybe they still have that perspective, but the more they overestimate protections, the more they actually think it ties their hands, the more they like it.
Principals have a tenure protection in the state in that if they are removed from being a principal, that can be done at will. But if they have been employed long enough, they still have a tenure right as a teacher.
So it's right of return.
It's
Yeah.
We do that with administrators here, right of
Yeah,
return to
that makes
to
sense.
the faculty.
So actually, so maybe that's where it's coming from. So I'm going to make that note because I didn't think about that. So these probably don't surprise anybody. I mean, we're not earth-shattering findings, right? So effectiveness, there's a lot in this slide, but basically we said, so how effective is tenure? We divided it into 3 categories. How good is it for accountability? So here, teachers think that tenure is way better at creating accountability. They also think that they are more likely to say that tenure is effective at attracting new teachers to the profession, retaining teachers in the profession. I mean, broadly, everybody kind of thought it was, teachers thought it was effective, right? But then when it came to protecting teachers' rights, it flipped. Principals think it's much more effective at protecting teachers' rights. So here again, just the descriptive stats of who agreed with these things and how well tenure works, but when we get to actually looking at how understanding impacts that, no significant effect when we're just looking at understanding, but these overestimators, again, not a big shock. They think that tenure does more things, it improves the teacher supply, and they also think that tenure protects, right? I mean, that's what we measured, so I'm glad that this came out that way, right? So not so earth-shattering there, but we can see that, you know, how you misunderstand impacts the attitudes you have around the policy.
Dana, what's
Yeah.
the p-value testing? What is it that you're actually doing there?
So,
These different questions have different responses. This particular one, these effectiveness and it's like how effective is tenure for these various goals. Those were all Likert scales, like
Mhm.
5
Yeah.
point, and so
right there.
those significance are from an ordered probability model.
Okay.
It's an ordered logic.
And I mean, we have a few principles in the overestimator, you know, so we have small numbers there, so we're not surprised we don't have anything in terms of significant effects. But then the last thing that we tested is the value of tenure. So what we kind of said to teachers is, hey, they had one of these three options. Hey, would you be willing to give up tenure for a 20% salary increase? And if they said yes, we went, hey, would you be willing to take 15%? So these randomly generated increases or decreases. And hey, would you be willing to give up tenure for each of these things? So they get more and more restrictive, right? And so we looked at how understanding and how much you estimate tenure protections impacts your willingness to take money in compensation for it, right? So there was no significant effect here, which is just the lightest one, changing that probationary period, adding 2 years, making it 5. But when we asked teacher to give up tenure, so instead you get 5-year contracts or year-to-year contracts, even if you're getting significant salary increases. I mean, we put like large hypothetical things. Basically, overestimators need more money to be bought out, which also doesn't shock us, right? So the more you overestimate tenure protections, the more dollar value you place on it. Again, it's intuitive. So,
Dan, I think
Yeah.
the way that people understand the way that works is if you were answering the survey and answered saying your role as a teacher,
mhm.
you would randomly get one of those
Right.
3 questions.
Mhm.
So you got to answer one of those 3, and then you get the bid, and you could agree, take it or leave it.
But I think the other piece is to understand that we're asking this because it was also in the context of legislators wanting to know, one, what do we need to pay educators to attract and retain them? And 2, what is the impact of tenure in terms of that decision? Because obviously, again, we have some legislators who want to eliminate tenure, and we're looking at them saying, that's a very expensive proposition. You know, if you want to
It might be.
eliminate,
It might
it could be, right?
Right.
Depending on, so this was just an attempt to see if the teachers had a choice,
Yeah.
Yeah.
how much they said they would need to get compensated to give up weaken their tenure right or give it up.
Right, so, just trying to inform that conversation because, if we change teacher working conditions writ large are very important in teachers' decisions to stay or leave. Compensation, both in terms of monetary compensation and job protection, are very important factors in those decisions, and so we're trying to understand that.
So we had smaller numbers for each question
So,
because
excuse me, why did you cross out the first one?
there was no significant difference.
Oh, yeah, but we
That's
did
all.
there was no significant effect of the tenure
Of the very-
understanding.
right.
But there was a value
Oh,
that
yeah.
people came up with for that.
Yes, yeah, I
Are you
just
gonna show
looked
these
that up.
values?
So the value of tenure, I don't have them in these slides, but I could certainly,
They're in our
Published them in
report.
our
It's in the
Yeah.
initial report, yeah.
But they ranked, obviously the first one was the least valuable and the last
Right.
one was the most. It would range from like $10,000 to $30,000 a year.
Yeah,
A year,
it was
yeah.
a lot.
So it was
Yeah.
quite a bit of money.
so, but we were just checking their likelihood to accept money in exchange for rights. And so it's kind of not shocking that the more you think it gives you, the more money you would want to be bought out, but so for the discussion, also because we combined these two, that's why this was crossed out. We combined, because these were basically the same in terms, we combined
I'm
the
assuming you
responses.
looked at this stuff, but your sample has 20% of people that are tenured. I don't know, off the top of your head, how did the answers differ based on whether or not I actually have tenure or
Yeah.
my duration of teaching?
It wasn't significant.
So, yeah, I
It was not
didn't bring
significant at
those.
all, and maybe that's
It's
because there weren't
fascinating.
enough people who had
Mhm.
tenure, but,
Well, I mean, it was 2 out of 10, and you had 5
Yeah, it
candidates,
just
and
wasn't-
so
it
you
could
had
have been.
80 people.
Mhm.
Well, more
But
than
I think
yeah,
only
100
about
people.
100 still should have been
Yeah.
like 25 people on each of these, so,
Mhm.
but it just wasn't significant at all. And because we didn't have that many, the N was not that large, it didn't keep, all 20 variables we tried in the equation, because they were all correlated.
Yeah, for this, and I just, to be clear, since they are only one of these, like for each question, we have only a third of the full
Sure,
responses.
sure.
So we had much more than like 100 for the other ones, we had like 300.
Yeah, but the short answer was
Yeah.
not important in their
So,
answers.
and we checked
Which is
whether or not they had tenure, a couple of other things, like the assignment that they had, and didn't detect. So just wanting to get to the discussion with you all. So public misunderstanding, not an earth-shattering finding. This is something I pulled out of something published in 1924 saying the public doesn't understand tenure and that's why we're having a problem passing it. So no shock that public doesn't understand it. We see examples of this all the time. This was a key theme in our focus group. But that teachers and principals misunderstand tenure, that's new. We hadn't seen that. No one's really documented public misunderstanding of tenure empirically, but we certainly have enough evidence. But for teachers, that's a new finding, something we hadn't seen before. So the thing that we're actually wondering is, maybe we didn't test tenure understanding, but we're actually testing the gap between statute and practice here. Because after we tested what people knew, we actually gave them the answers. We kind of explained what tenure is and how it works. But the differences that they had were still detectable. So we're thinking that possibly teachers and principals told us the real story. In focus group interviews, we have evidence of this, that it does play out very differently in reality than as it's written in statute. And so what's been described as a phantom policy by actually the chair of my dissertation committee is this idea that everybody believes that the policy is written in such a way and they act on it to the point that it becomes a de facto policy and it's actually what's guiding activity and action rather than whatever is written. So it's maybe that's what we have going on here rather than misunderstanding, it's that the practice has become a phantom policy. So looking at that phantom policy, we saw from our work that tenure has a dollar value. We know that from the literature too. We see that if you eliminate or weaken tenure, as Musina talked about, in any state, we're seeing that you're going to have salary increase that goes with it to ensure market competitiveness, and we're starting to see that adjusting in the places that have done it, and that teachers value it, and that they make their career decisions on tenure. So the interesting thing that this study contributes is that the more teachers overestimate those tenure protections, the higher they value tenure. And so when they're overestimating it, when they're acting on this phantom policy is actually constituting a cost saving to taxpayers, which kind of interesting. And so when we're looking at tenure inflation then, so when it happens when teachers overestimate the value of tenure, tenure's more valuable and it's more expensive for states to weaken or abolish tenure. And when principals do it, they feel their hands are tied, right? And that's what the critics are complaining about. But the irony of it is that to fix this, you don't need to change policy at all. You just need to call in the Ghostbusters, you know? But if you do that, because people are also complaining about the cost of education, if you do that, you have to pay teachers more. So we've got sort of this interesting catch-22 here where, what to do is as much about killing the phantom as it is about looking at the policy itself. And the interesting thing is that if we have this phantom policy that's working so strongly, the statute kind of becomes irrelevant. So, which doesn't do much for us, for our work, because we're always looking at statute. But, so as we're wrapping up, I was sort of thinking, so this is kind of an interesting phenomenon. So where else do we see things like this happening? Because we see lots of places where people have really strong opinions, but I would venture that their understanding may be a little bit weak. And we see that in the policy arena, we see it with scientific concepts. But we're still legislating all of this stuff as people understand or misunderstand. So, sort of thinking of the big picture as we're concluding the talk, right? So what's the place for facts or scientific evidence in this world where the number of likes a Facebook page gets trumps a research study in terms of the FaceTime it gets in the news or how much people pay attention to it? Particularly this week where you have people making up news on Facebook, apparently, like,
No.
like, where does our work fit into this, you know, and what are we to do about that? And where, you know, and the fascinating thing is sort of the hegemony in all of this is that these fake news stories or some of these misunderstandings actually work to the detriment of people who go to the polls and then vote for them. So what do we do in this arena?
Is there a problem?
So, well, apparently I almost tripped over the microphone wire, but yeah, I mean, I think it's just an interesting question is if this phenomenon is with something as, you know, nuanced as teacher tenure, like where else might we see this same kind of thing happening? But definitely since we're in ed policy, we're interested as it relates to teacher tenure. So what we're gonna do next is we're gonna finish this article, and we certainly appreciate any input you've got for us, probably put a policy brief out. If you've got suggestions of what we should do with this work more locally, we'd be happy to hear it. And then this also fits into our teacher supply and demand work. We've got some stuff forthcoming. Please.
I'm Richard Kern. I'm the Assistant Executive Director of NEA Alaska, which means that I supervise our staff program that represents teachers and advocates on their behalf on these issues. And so I have a pragmatic day-to-day understanding of teacher tenure in the state. And as great a researchers as you guys are, you also don't understand the nuances of tenure. And it starts out in this state, tenure only applies to continuation of contract. It does not have anything to do with dismissal. Dismissal is, under statute, a different concept than non-retention. Non-retention means that upon the conclusion of a one-year teacher contract, you may be let go. Dismissal is being fired. Now, the confusion in the state is that the criteria under which you can be dismissed or non-retained are identical, except for arbitrators who have split a hair in this state with respect to performance. Under statutes, it's statutorily defined that you can be dismissed for substantial non-compliance with the written directives of the superintendent, otherwise known as, what do we call that?
Insubordination.
Insubordination, thank you. So, you know, you get mouthed off, you know, you're gone. The second portion of this is if you commit an act that under the laws of the state would constitute a crime of moral turpitude, theft, for example, regardless of where it happens, and regardless of whether you've been convicted of it or not. If you committed the act, regardless of conviction, you get fired. And then the third one is non-performance or incompetence is the third criterion. Now, it is a slightly lower standard of incompetence, or a slightly different standard for tenure than it is for regular due process. They are both due process issues. So you can't be fired without due process. But that applies to somebody who is in their first day of work as a brand new teacher. You still have to have due process to fire these people. Under tenure, they can be non-retained for any reason the district deems adequate in their first 3 years of employment. First day of the fourth year, then the district has a due process obligation for non-retention. And so that, I mean, that's the hair splitting that goes on. So you can see why it would be pretty easy for the public to, you know, I don't give a damn, you know. there is nothing that, that really would defeat facts greater than a warmly held opinion.
Yes. Well, and you know, in the focus groups, we heard misunderstandings on things that seem that they'd be cut and dried, like, can you take tenure from one district to
yeah.
another?
Mhm.
And that was surprising to us that you had this arguing going on. We also.
But there's a reason for that.
Mhm.
And the
The
reason for
statute
that is if you have
changed.
achieved tenure in a school district, and then without a break in your service, if you go to work for another school district,
Mhm.
your tenure, the length of time it takes you to gain tenure is reduced by a year.
Yeah,
Right.
to 2.
But people were saying, I took my tenure as in, you know, I left Anchorage, I went to Matsu, I continued to be tenured
Right.
without understanding that they weren't.
So the irony of what I found really interesting in this is that we asked these questions about understanding, you know, which were basically as a just taken straight out of the statute. And then after they answer those questions, the screen pops up in your internet survey that shows the statute and
Yeah.
shows the answers
Yeah,
to the
the
questions.
exact.
And then after that, we asked them about their opinions of tenure effectiveness. And so after we've already told them whether they were right or wrong in their questions, that's when we asked them about the, you know, the questions about the effectiveness of tenure and how much they'd be willing to accept to give it up. And so and it was still, and their answers to the questions that they missed were still relevant to explaining their answers afterwards. So the point is, just showing them the statute doesn't necessarily change their deeply held beliefs.
Right.
The
That
facts,
surprises
that's the Phantom policy, so the facts aren't really
Right.
it's no such thing as a fact.
How do you know that?
Well, that's right, we're in a
Well,
post-fact
just
era.
statistically, it still was correlated with their answers.
Yeah, but I mean, if they didn't answer the questions before and answer
No,
them
so we don't
after,
know why
so you
they
don't know
didn't.
the extent to which.
It's
you
true, they
actually
might not have
maybe the
understood.
misperception was gigantic beforehand.
It might have been.
Seeing the right answers actually helped it, right?
That's right.
We don't know that.
We don't know if it actually reduced their effect.
Yeah,
All we
yeah.
know is that there was still a residual effect.
Why
So-
were only 20% tenure? Does that imply
Yeah.
20% had less than 3 years of service? Is that
I-
representative
yeah.
of the state
So-
as a whole?
So
But you
we-
had another slide that said that the average amount of work experience was 16 years, so
So-
that doesn't.
There's I can double check that, but there's a lot of mobility within Alaska districts, particularly in early career. A lot of people are moving to rural districts and then relocating to urban ones. So
So you can have
I
6
should
years of
look.
experience
Mhm.
and not yet be tenured because you did 3
Right,
years
right.
in another district and 3 years in
Mhm.
Anchorage.
or 3 years in California.
Did you only survey or offer the survey to public education teachers?
We sense it everywhere. So we had.
What was the percentage of non-public education teachers' responses? And just, did they participate
They-
to?
They did. They were excluded from this analysis because we were interested in the public education. So they were included in the broader public. So we had not only public or private schools, but some of the people who were facilitating the homeschool classrooms who
Uh-huh.
answered that. So we restricted this analysis to public educators, and I could pull up how many other educators we had. I'd have to look. It was small,
Yeah,
but
the
we did.
proportion is so small of
Mhm.
public school, of
Yeah.
private
Non-public.
schools,
Right.
yeah.
But it was offered, and they were included in the broader analysis we did for the state.
The reason I asked was the understanding of tenure. Were non-public education teachers more knowledgeable about what tenure is than public education teachers where tenure would apply?
So, you know, I don't know, but I honestly bet that we didn't have a good enough, representative enough sample to actually definitively say that anyway. But we posed this to everybody, and what was interesting is we got school business officers and other education professions. And even though there was a lot of misunderstanding on just those really simple true-false questions that really boiled down some of the nuance of tenure for the respondents, other people responded there was much more misunderstanding outside of teachers and principals, believe it or not. So even superintendents and school business officers, who you would think would know this pretty intimately because it's their job as enforcers to a certain
And
extent.
one other quick question, what time of the year was this offered, during the school year or
Yeah.
outside the school year?
February,
Spring.
March, April.
No, yeah, spring. I think
Yeah.
it was open for 6 weeks, February, March of 2015.
Yeah.
And we did the focus group interviews at the NEA
That was
thing
January,
in
early-
December
Was
when we
that
did the
December or
focus groups.
January, when we did the
Yeah.
big-
January.
Yeah.
Oh, it
January.
was?
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Okay.
this would be also sort of in
Mhm.
contract issuance window.
Mm.
So I mean, this would be during the time when teachers would be
Yeah.
thinking in terms of their contracts.
Mm.
I've got a quick question, and you probably said this, and maybe I missed it, but did you try to measure somehow the people's values actually going into the survey? I mean, meaning like, it's just kind of my perception that folks that are against tenure typically think that teachers are interchangeable commodity, that they're like perfect substitutes in economic language versus like if they're a skilled profession where they're not perfect substitutes.
So, I apologize. Part of what you said,
Oops.
I was sorry.
I can,
I'm sorry.
So I was just kind of curious, did you try measuring people's value judgments, like before you actually start asking about understanding of tenure, and meaning that did you ask like if did people think teachers were perfect substitutes depending on experience or qualifications or anything versus that they're maybe a skilled profession where they're not
No.
perfect substitutes?
So, I think
because
that,
I think that might cloud somebody's
Yeah.
understanding and desires. And then I've got kind of a follow-up question for Mr. Kern, that if there's such a misunderstanding about teacher tenure, whose responsibility then is it to educate the public? Offhand. Might not be related to the study, but.
Actually, that was, if I can.
Okay,
We
yeah.
we actually, that's one of our recommendations that we didn't think we'd have time for, is like, what is the union, what is teacher education programs, like how do we burst some of this phantom bubble? But there are implications to doing that, which could be deleterious to teachers and students actually, so it's kind of more complicated than just, getting it right.
And the other piece was when we were talking about symbolic politics versus self-interest, as that's a set of concepts where people's views, in the face of evidence that a particular policy will benefit them, will still vote against that because of their beliefs, their ideologies, and that was looked at with school busing very, that was sort of where it came out of, with some of that theory about how do perceptions of race impact the way people, or it was also very clearly analyzed in the lead up to Reagan's election, where it was looking at white working class and white union members who were voting against policies to strengthen the working class because of race politics that were being used. And so that's an interesting question on this, that are some of the people who would, again, benefit from better understanding these policies and having maybe their view of the policy is based on the symbolic politics, not on what would be best for their children, the quality of the schools.
And
in short, we're not the messenger on this because we would be viewed as being self-aggrandizing. So, I mean, automatically we have a credibility issue just opening our mouth regardless of how accurate we speak.
Yeah.
So, and I did want to say, Matt double-checked, and we had that backwards, that it was 80% were tenured, 20% were untenured, which makes a lot more sense, and sorry about that, my bad, my typo. So that does make more sense, though.
Do you have a recommendation for that piece where the policy's not actually being enacted? Because that's what part of the results I was hearing, saying that people may or may not understand the policy, but the other part is that it's not really being followed particularly.
So, yeah, I mean, basically the phantom policy, what people construct as the understanding is guiding action.
Yeah.
But I couldn't make a recommendation as to what we should do
Well,
differently. That
Other
would-
than, I mean, there's,
Which one do-
so there's 3 entities that need to be looking at this. The School Boards Association, the Administrators Association, and the School Business Officers, because those, you know, school administrators and school business officers are gonna be the ones who are actually making sure that we are implementing it correctly, and the school board's members are supposed to be providing oversight, and if it's, and we don't have a sense of how broad the misapplication is.
Yeah.
I
We
do.
can- Oh, you do, okay.
I do, absolutely. You know, the presumption here is that, we're only getting rid of 1 or 2 teachers a year per district, and we all know that we got a whole bunch more teachers than that tiny number who just aren't cutting it.
Mhm.
Well, except for the fact that we lose over 80% of our teachers in their first 5 years of employment.
Yeah.
But are those bad teachers or good teachers?
A mixture of both. But in my experience and observationally and anecdotally, and how much ever you want to trust the union goon in the room, my experience has been that it is really difficult for an incompetent teacher to remain in the profession.
Mhm.
Because, you know, I said it earlier, you know, the kids run them out. That's a fact. That is what happens, you know. Kids are vicious. They have no moral code.
But and the other piece is administrators said to,
Well,
many administrators
and
said, it's
it's-
not that hard, you just have to document that there's a
But-
process to follow.
And the issue with that too is administrator turnover in this state is gigantic too, and
Yes.
so the administrative processes get interrupted year to year
Yeah.
as they relate to this, so that's a big component of it as well.
But the other issues with our tenure policies is if we think that the phantom policy can help retain some of the teachers we want to retain, and this in particular is that when I leave one district and go to another, I want to keep tenure. We had a number of educators who said to us, my kids are grown, I love the Anchorage School District, but I think I could really make a difference in rural Alaska, but I will not go out there because I would be non-tenured and I can't carry my seniority
all the
in
years
terms
of
the pay
service too,
scale.
right.
And so that's another, you know,
Mhm.
there's some broader implications to this about maybe tenure policy needs to be revamped to exactly provide those incentives
The things we're seeking to
Yeah,
actually promote the, yeah.
So, I mean, I guess the overarching question
Mhm.
to my mind is how would teachers and or principals behave differently in a world where they actually understood tenure policy perfectly? I mean,
So-
how does it
Mm.
change teacher behavior if I
So-
understood it very well? Aside from the fact that I'm valuing it monetarily differently, which right now there is no actual proposition to actually give them money.
Give them money.
Give it up.
So, well, I would say for principals, if they're overestimating the way that they would approach each individual circumstance, if they were more aware, they would be able to more adeptly navigate the processes that protect teachers, or that protect them less than they think. So I think for principals, significantly in those administrative processes, and for teachers, the underestimators, who we didn't see as many of and we didn't see as significant of impacts, but if people are not fully aware of some of the rights that they do have, I think there's an opportunity there, and I don't know to what extent those rights are being infringed upon.
But I think
So-
there's another interesting question, which is there were principals and superintendents who talked about the stress of that point at the end of year 3, where they're not really sure. A teacher seems promising, but has made some missteps, and this sense that if we give them tenure, we're stuck with them,
Mhm.
seemed to be incentivizing
Mhm.
a more conservative approach to giving tenure. And if they realize that actually you still have an opportunity to review them every year, and if somebody
What's
really
the
screws
tenure
up.
rate? What's the percent of people that fail tenure?
That failed tenure?
Or
Very,
that
yeah.
failed?
So it's very, very, very small.
But I think,
Most-
I'm
yeah.
gonna guess that it varies considerably by district, because we do know of districts where you can see a churning, where entire populations of teachers have been denied tenure at that point.
Are you talking about people who are just plain non-retained because
After
they
year
haven't
three.
yet?
No, and I was asking, she was saying that.
So at that year
maybe-
three, how
maybe-
many
maybe
districts
principals
turn
are
around and say?
conservatives are
And you know, I don't know if
Quite a
anybody,
few.
if anybody's analyzed, because this is, I don't know how much this is lore or this is reality, that there are some districts that every time a teacher hits year three, they're gone. Now, there are some districts that can't keep teachers long enough to even have to make that decision, and
Yeah.
far too many of those.
And there
but-
are districts that routinely do that just because they want to churn through, or they want to protect positions for, for teachers for whatever reasons the board may deem appropriate in that district.
Yes.
And I think, one of the challenges is we didn't intend on doing this analysis when we started it, but when we looked at understanding, we thought, this is bizarre, we really need to dig a little deeper on this. So if we had set out to study exactly this question, we would have structured this a little bit differently, I think. So taking the data we had, we still think that there's some interesting things to talk about, but it definitely begs a follow-up analysis with this research objective in mind, so.
I apologize, I was late. I was at the dentist. So.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. It was okay. I didn't hear the beginning,
Mhm.
and I just came in the door when you had the list of who all you surveyed. Did you perchance survey specifically identified PTA people?
We did. We advertised through PTA organizations, so the state PTA and then the smaller PTA organizations, as many as we could talk to. I think that we had about 70 or 80 people who identified as a parent or a community member, so very,
But
very
that's-
small participation.
Okay, parent and community member
So-
is not necessarily a PTA member.
No, we use,
And the reason I
right,
say that
right.
is some schools, the PTA
Mhm.
is a group of parents whose arms got twisted to put their name on the list.
Yeah.
And that's
So-
it, they don't ever meet. And what I'm going back to is the public perception, not
Yeah,
the
right.
districts or the professions'
Mhm.
perception of what tenure is, but the general public who are going to be reading those Time and Newsweek
Mhm.
headlines. PTA is sort of, in my view, a little bit in between that.
Mhm.
They are active, they have kids in school, but they're not a teacher.
Mhm.
And they don't have any interest in being a teacher in most
So,
cases.
that's a good point. I mean, we use them to advertise the survey, so we expect that that a lot of people who took it in that parents and community members demographic were in fact PTA members.
Okay.
So we did get their responses. I don't know that we actually specifically asked, are you a PTA member or are you just a parent? I don't think we did.
Never put
but-
the word just in front of it.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it
I
that way.
understand.
So I don't think we ever differentiated between, are you a concerned citizen or are you actually actively involved in one of these organizations?
And one of
That's
the
a
hard
good
things
point.
was this survey
And-
was broad. It was about, teacher salary and tenure. And I think there are a lot of people who didn't take it because they thought they needed to have some expertise
Mm.
to engage in it. I mean, we tried our darndest to get the word out about this, and it was hard to get.
Well,
How long does
and-
it take for a person to sit down and answer all the
It was
questions?
probably like a 35-minute exercise. It was not a
Yeah,
short
all on the
survey.
computer.
So does that sound about right? I'm trying to remember. I think it was about, I could look. I
It
mean, we
varied,
know how
but
long
yeah,
it took.
30 minutes. Yeah,
But-
that's a long
Yeah.
self.
And we would
survey.
expect, and also the political climate in which this study was posed, it certainly sounded like an attack on teachers and it was not friendly language to teachers. So that was the climate also in which we were trying to conduct the study. We hadn't created the language, that wasn't where we were coming from, but it certainly was the context.
And we started this, I think the state budget and oil prices tanking
Mhm.
coincided about, we'd gotten, when we were asked to do this research, things were looking a little uncertain. And it was December, January, when things really began to tank. So I think a lot of people looked at what we were doing and started thinking whatever, because things were beginning to look so
Yeah.
dire.
And I know we're over time, so I'm happy to stay. I don't know about my other authors here, but thank you. just, I'm allowing you to go if you don't want to stay any longer, but I'll stay and talk because I'm interested. So, yeah. But we did think, oh, thanks. So, but we do think, I mean, teachers and principals, their answers, they did understand better than any of the other groups that we collected data on. We would love to know what the general public understands. We just didn't get enough data to actually say that definitively in any way, so.
Did you want to sign in to get on
Oh,
the
yeah.
list?
Yeah, well, I'm on the mailing list, but I'll do it, that's all right, I'll do it anyway. I would love to see a survey similar, and not have it, have a survey where you're telephoned or you're knocking, the door is knocked on, instead of this, here's an opportunity.
Right,
You
right.
get a whole different perspective.
Yeah.
I have a political background in political surveys that you are chosen, not you get to choose to
Right.
participate,
That's
comes out with very different answers.
If you saw the budget that we were working with for this whole study.
Yeah. Yeah.
More than you
So,
understand.
yeah. And I think, and that's part of the reason when we talk about teachers and principals, we at least know who they are in the state. We had the database, we were able to say, there are this many, and this is what we do know about them. We couldn't do that for the general public because we didn't know who. So yeah, you're talking, we would love to do that with a budget that was adequate to do such a thing. Yeah.
So, but we know, or you were saying, so anecdotally, it's believed that the public understands less about tenure than teachers and principals do. And this study illuminates that teachers and principals might not understand
As much as we thought they did, yes.
Yeah.
So the public understands
Even less.
Yeah.
So probably even less.
Yeah.
And yet, they're going to the polls and voting on these issues in a lot of the different states, and so that's an issue.
No.
Yeah.
But by and large, that they haven't been through, they aren't part of that tenured system.
So, yeah. And a lot of them come
If you
from.
can boil the message down to simple and wrong, you've got a winner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are school business officers are they in the larger study or?
They are.
Oh, yeah.
And we
They were
got
actually-
almost all school business
Yeah.
officers and almost all superintendents
They
participated. The problem is there's only like
Yeah, there's fewer
very few,
school business
28.
officers than there are districts.
Right.
Because there are districts
So-
that don't have their own or that
Yeah.
children.
So even though participation was fabulous, it wasn't enough for us to do analysis with those numbers, just because there's so few in the state. But
The 3 states that dropped tenure,
Mhm.
were those as a result of legislative action or of public vote?
I'd have to look at the context
they're
within
on
which,
it.
I think
Legislative
North
action,
Carolina
North
was,
Carolina and
yeah,
Florida for sure.
yeah.
It'd be Jeb and.
So the
Yeah, and
The
that's where.
Idaho, it was the voters repealed it. So it was the voters, so the legislators did it and the voters actually repealed it with the ballot initiative. So definitely in Idaho too, the voters came out in support of tenure there, which is
And
kind of
Idaho's a very conservative state.
cool. So, yeah,
So if they
yeah.
repealed, so they left tenure in place to make sure we're.
So the
smart about
legislature,
apples and bananas.
the legislature effectively, and this is more simple than it is, but eliminated tenure effectively. And then the voters got a ballot initiative and repealed that legislative action.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So,
And it'll be interesting to see if anything switches in North Carolina.
Yeah.
Mhm.
North Carolina's teaching force is, the numbers are just
But
tanking.
when you look at the current problems with teacher supply and demand, North Carolina is at the bottom. I think it's like Arizona because their pay is so low that, if the pay, if we're saying if tenure is worth maybe $20,000 or, the pay disparities are greater than that.
Yeah. And you
That's
also.
some research that I'd actually like to see. Some of these states that have done things like that, Florida and North Carolina, for example, were leading the field in teacher quality issues. In North Carolina, they had more national board certified teachers than any other state in the union. They made a huge push back in the 90s, early 90s, to really improve teacher quality, and the vehicle that they used for that was national board certification. And they would, there was a financial incentive to it. I mean, your wages improved by, in the neighborhood of 10 grand a year.
Oh, that's way more than anyone
Yeah,
here.
here you don't
Oh,
get very
yeah,
much.
yeah. It was substantial. It was master's degree or better worth of rigor
Yeah.
and reward. Same thing in Florida. In Florida, they actually gave release time to teachers on the clock to do national board training. And in Florida, they also gave 10,000. They gave 5,000 for the cert and another 5 grand if you were willing to work to get other people certified. Both of those programs, of course, have gone by the way because they couldn't afford to continue to support them. And so, I'd be curious to see the correlation.
Right.
And you start taking a look at Wisconsin, which every year was first or second in ACT scores nationally, and now they've tanked. And you've seen a huge outflow of really quality teachers out of that system.
I do think a guy, Chingos, don't quote me on the name, did actually look at like a pre-post thing in Florida. I'll find that and send it to you, because
That'd
they
be
really
great,
did.
Because, there for a while, our legislature, and especially the House Education Committee a couple, 3 years ago, when Representative Gaddis was chairing it, there wasn't anything that came out of Florida that she wasn't supportive of. I worked in Florida for a little while, and I never understood that because it was, they did the best they could possibly do in the face of stupid policy.
They've also got a really good statewide data system there as far as those things go, so they're able to do better analyses in Florida than we can do in a lot of other states.
And North Carolina has that survey of teachers every year that's way
Yeah,
more robust
so-
data than we have.
So,
Absolutely.
so there's.
What's the best measurement at this point of teacher quality?
So there's a new study that just was released, like I got it last week, that was starting to look at the teacher observations that different states are putting into place. Way back when we had the Alaska Partnership for Teacher Enhancement, which helped fund revamping the Master of Arts in Teaching, we paid a lot of money to educators who were specially trained to do observations. And I think that's it. If you're not in the classroom watching a teacher for more than 1 hour, and there was a big national study on measures of teaching. Craig, what was the name of that? The big study, the measures of, it's not.
STAR?
MAT, it was the one that was being done out of, is it MAT? It was the measures of teaching. Anyway, and they were looking at a combination that you needed observations, principal observations. You put student and parent perceptions in there lightly. I think that's an indication that because you know that there's a lot of bias, because a hard teacher gets at times lower, and an effusive teacher, no matter how poor, gets good evaluations. So it really is around pre and post kinds of measures, and so you can see growth, but not the kinds of growth measures that are just done on standardized tests, not limited to individual student growth, and then observation. It really is.
Smaller studies are really showing that administrator evaluations are some of the most accurate ways to measure teacher quality. They're just not standardized in any way, so you can't do very good comparisons with them.
And time consuming. How do you do it well
they're
with
time
that
consuming.
number of teachers?
You say that there's,
And
what's accurate. So it's accurate is in the eye of the beholder.
Right.
And the economists who are, all the economists,
And they can also-
economists, but they tend to want to be evidence-based. And so unfortunately, that's all has to be based on standardized tests.
Yeah.
So you can check statistically whether some teachers, on average, have the students they get go advance faster on a standardized test
programs.
Not explained by
Yeah.
education experience or any of the observational
But-
data, it just, they
Yeah.
still don't really know why.
But I've read two, I think, of those where the administrator evaluations correlate with that growth that you're
Sometimes,
looking
yes,
for, so.
But not as strongly as
so-
we would hope.
No, but, and yeah, it's a sticky thing to
Very
measure,
difficult.
but, yeah.
Is there still the new teacher mentor program?
In the state of Alaska, well, so we're doing the cost of teacher turnover study right now, and so it does still technically exist, but it's defunded largely, right?
There's still the ASMP got the big federal grant, so they're still
Okay,
doing
okay.
that with the 5-day districts. So that's the
But-
data that
oh,
Paul keeps asking us for.
So what we're finding, though, is that a lot of districts are doing small, local, homegrown mentor programs in addition to that